All right, everyone. So welcome to this workshop, and thanks for your patience with that little hiccup getting started. Thank you to NCEP and its staff for really doing a very impressive, tremendous job in organizing these last few days. I'm Julie Michals with E for the Future, and we are going to kick off and get started because we have a lot to cover today. So first off, it will be helpful to pose a quick poll question for everybody about how familiar you are with the NSPM. And I think, is that going to be from my end or from your end? There we go. Thank you. So we're asking this question because we've been doing a bit of a roadshow over the past 6 months and even prior to that around the NSPM, and we find that it's always a mixed bag of how many people know about this National Standard Practice Manual in some capacity, and we want to help us guide us today as to how much we cover perhaps certain topics. So maybe we can see what that result looks like, please. Okay, wow, so not many not familiar, some somewhat, a few very. All right, thank you, that's very helpful feedback. So with that, we're looking forward to sharing with you today our information and about this publication. Okay, so I'm sharing with you here essentially the table of contents of the NSPM. And you'll see there's a lot of topics here. I certainly encourage all of you to go look at the guidance document in its full capacity. I don't have time to cover all these topics here today. And based on some of the discussion from Monday on the panel, I was with Commissioner Anthony and with Sneller Price from E3. We really intended to take the discussion today a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the issues raised in that session. So to that end, we're really going to be talking today about the BCA framework, and the NSPM puts forth a benefit cost analysis framework that we touched on Monday. I did, but we'll give it a bit more time here as we start off this workshop. And then we're going to do some deeper dives. We're going to later this afternoon going into some examples that touch on system-wide DR portfolios, use of primary tests versus secondary tests, and rate impacts. There's a whole lot of other things in here that we're not going to get into today, but we'll be polling you later at the end about what other topics are of particular interest to you. Okay. So let me begin, and again, we only have 20 minutes at the front end, or 15 at this point, to go through this. But it's very important to present the 3 components of the framework that's provided in the NSPM. We will review the principles to start this discussion, and we're going to review the multi-step process for developing a primary test, and then look at developing secondary tests and in what cases and what use they have. So these components is what the BCA framework entails. And to start then is we have these 8 principles, which I shared with you back in back on Monday. And again, as I noted then, these are the foundational principles that the NSPM sets forth should guide benefit cost analysis of DERs, and really broadly in investment in any resources. And that first one, some of these built on prior to the NSPM for DERs, as you know, there was a NSPM for energy efficiency first published. There were a couple principles added to those and also expanded. So the first principle really stresses the importance of ensuring to avoid bias in investment in resources, to make sure that resources are compared with each other and that they're treated consistently. And we'll see some examples of that here today. And secondly, what is fundamental to BCA analysis for any jurisdiction is to consider, why are we investing in this resource? What are the reasons and objectives and goals for investing in these resources, and where are they articulated? This was one of the major shortfalls of the California Standard Practice Manual. It just sets forth different tests with different perspectives, but it doesn't really account for the fact that one jurisdiction may have a different set of goals and objectives than another. And hence, I think why we see around the country so many different modified versions of a TRC, because states have tried to incorporate some of their policies, but it's done sort of ad hoc and not necessarily consistently. So in a way, the principle here says, let's just be clear and then also transparent, the seventh principle, about why it is that we're investing in these resources. The issue of symmetry is fundamental. If you have asymmetrical treatment of costs and benefits, we'll look at an example of that. That can present inconsistent analysis of resources and a bias towards one resource over another. And then accounting for relevant material impacts. Again, what is relevant beyond utility system impacts is really based on those applicable policies. So again, we'll give some examples there. Conducting forward-looking long-term analysis that captures incremental impacts of DERs as opposed to accounting for sunk costs is important, and it ties, in some ways, it ties to looking at separately at BCA from rate impact analyses, avoiding double counting through clearly defined impacts. That may come up in some cases for DER BCA analysis. And then transparency is really about the process for ensuring that the analysis results, the key assumptions, are clear, and through state agency processes, dockets or proceedings, whatnot, that they're made available and known at the underlying methodologies for accounting for these are also transparent. So these are kind of no-brainer. One reads these and says, okay, that all makes sense. There's nothing here that's really necessarily causes me heartburn. But in application, they actually really can help a jurisdiction get through some issues that have been a challenge for BCA analysis for both efficiency and increasingly for other DER resources. And Tim will be going into some depth today on the importance of separating benefit cost analyses for rate impact analyses on the basis that they answer different questions. Now, these principles, they are not mutually exclusive, and it may be necessary that there are trade-offs made. And I think we'll get nuances and flavors of that today. So what question does a primary test answer? It answers which resources have benefits that exceed costs and therefore merit utility acquisition or support on behalf of their customers. Now, merit does not mean it's a slam dunk. As Abigail Anthony said that on Monday, this is a challenge that they've seen in Rhode Island, where just because it passes their primary test, their Rhode Island test, it doesn't mean it's a necessary investment. There are other considerations, but yet the primary test is a starting point to really understand where benefits exceed costs, and therefore should be carefully considered for investment. So next, the next element of the framework in developing your primary test are these 5 steps. And we are going to go into these in more depth, so I'm not going to spend time on them now. But essentially, you'll see that this is where the injection of the principles happens in these different steps. And in the NSPM, there's more specific guidance and examples provided as to what specific steps are involved and what key considerations are necessary. Now, let's talk about the primary test using the NSPM leads to what the NSPM refers to as a jurisdiction-specific test. Now, when we published the NSPM for EE, we actually used a different term for this. We referred to it as a resource value test. But in developing the expanded NSPM for DRs this past summer, the advisory group raised issues. Some members of the advisory group that were representative from all over the industry expressed some real confusion about what is this RVT? Is it a type of test? And it led us to change the name, which we now refer to as a jurisdiction-specific test, because that is exactly what it is. It is specific to the jurisdiction. Now, this illustration shows that, well, theoretically, your jurisdiction's test could theoretically be aligned with one of the traditional tests, and that's shown in the JST 1, 2, and 3 examples, where the utility system impacts are included, but the blue shaded non-utility system impacts are those that reflect the perspective of what's behind those tests. So whether it's the utility perspective, the total resource perspective, or the societal perspective. But the fourth example here shows that you could be a jurisdiction where actually you have some pretty clear articulated goals that say, what are the reasons we're investing in these resources? And it may not include or may not be the same as those traditional test perspectives. And that's okay, because there are reasons your jurisdiction is investing in these resources. So that's the departure. The JST and the NSPM allows you to be flexible with the development of your test, and with transparency to be very clear on what's included and why. Now, use of secondary tests. The NSPM also provides guidance on how and when to use these. While the primary test should inform whether to fund or otherwise support DRs, the secondary test can help to address challenging situations. And again, I refer back to Commissioner Anthony's points and challenges that she articulated on Monday, where, you know, it may be that your primary test tells you to invest in all these cost-effective resources, but there are some hard decisions to be made. And I really think of it as more of an art than a science. And that's where decision makers like yourselves, whether you're commissioners or whether you're state energy office planners and the like, in determining what to include or not include will take some art. So secondary tests can help with this. They can address situations where there are inconsistent policy goals for different DR types. There may be cases where some DRs are marginally cost effective, either below or just slightly above a 1.0 BC ratio. And then there are implications of achieving policy goals. That's a really tricky situation where commissions are tasked to, where certain goals have been identified as relevant to electric system, distributed energy resources, but should electric payers pay for those policy goals? So Tim, again, will be going into more depth this afternoon in our session. So in part 2 of the NSPM, you'll see a whole section that's dedicated to what is the universe of different costs and benefits for utility system impacts, and then non-utility system impacts. What are the types of costs and benefits? How are they defined? So it's more of a library with some information on whether certain impacts are typically a benefit, a cost, or they may depend on certain use cases. And there is a cross-cutting chapter that addresses some of those factors. And then there's discrete DER chapters that go into more depth about why these different DERs, why impacts what are the factors that may affect those impacts. And then we won't be getting into this today, but it becomes more and more of an issue around analyzing BCA for DERs, is looking at those technology characteristics and these types of factors that I mentioned again on Monday, but just reminding you that this type of information and some guidance is provided in the NSPM. And then I mentioned host customer impacts. This is again examples of the range of impacts that may or may not apply in your jurisdiction, again, depending on your policies in the case of host customer impacts, as well as societal impacts. So these are just tables largely taken from those chapters and a lot more information provided with that. So one last slide here before I close and we have a bit of Q&A and then we hand it to Peter is we're going to just take a lens here and swoop down to look at one particular area of utility system impacts, but even actually more broadly is the issues of risk, reliability, and resilience, where we have found in some research we've done and where this is a publication by ACEEE, looking at issues around these 3 R's, I tend to refer to them as, and how very few states actually account for these impacts in their cost effectiveness tests, at least for efficiency. We've seen some developments in some places where there's clearly more and more interest and attention to capturing these impacts, in particular resilience. But we don't really see any states. We know the value is not 0 when it comes to that impact for DRs, but yet how do we quantify those impacts is a very important issue, a challenging one, but one that many states are grappling with. So with that, I think we're going to have a few questions, and then you'll learn more about this topic from Peter.
Thanks, Ms. Michals. I'm also going to drop into the chat your presentations. We were not able to get them posted, so we will work on that. But in the meantime, we'll post it in the chat in just a minute. Do we have any questions? If you have any questions, just show your camera and unmute yourself, and we will acknowledge you. Or if you'd like to send something to the chat, you can send it directly to Danielle or to everybody. Mr. Hobbins, do you have, as you're unmuted, do you have a question?
All right now, thank you, appreciate it. Did I put down chat? Oh my God, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're just unmuted, that's all.
Thank you, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Anybody else have a question before we move on to?
Can I ask a quick question of everyone? Have you all figured out how at the bottom of your screen you've got these reactions, right? And there's like isn't there like a thumbs up? I'm just curious, how many of you here feel like what I just presented in the basic BCA framework, like you get it, this makes sense, I kind of get where what this is about. And if that's the case, can you add a thumbs up emoji? Great, I see lots of thumbs up. And if not, please know that happy to follow up and provide more information after. If we don't cover everything here, certainly happy to answer your questions offline.
Julie, there is one question in the chat box.
Yes, from Joe. Okay. Where does one draw the circle when determining costs and benefits?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm not sure whether my question is explicit enough, but you know, when looking at costs and benefits, there is a cost and benefit to the DER provider or the DER aggregator, or you could draw a circle around the utility and the regulator, or you could draw a larger circle, right, around, you know, state objectives or even regional objectives, especially with all this FERC 2222 stuff happening, right? So things are getting really complicated, and I'm wondering how you might be able to account for where that circle needs to be drawn.
Shall I try that one, Julie?
Sure.
So great question.
It's a great question.
That's kind of what this is all about, is like, what is the scope of your analysis? What costs and benefits do you want to include? And as Julie said, we're very clear in the manual that all utility system impacts should be in your analysis. That's fundamental, and no one's really challenged that. After that, whether you include other impacts that are not utility system is a decision that each jurisdiction makes upon their goals. One obvious decision is, what about host customers, in or out? And then if they're in or out, then that defines your circle. The next one, which gets more nuanced, is the societal impacts. And I would put aggregators and third-party developers into that category of societal impacts. And if your jurisdiction decides that they want to account for all the costs, then they would include the DER aggregator and the DER provider costs as part of the scope. But they don't have to. It's, again, it's a matter of whether that's the lens and the scope that they want to use.
Great. Any other questions, or just, Joe, do you have any follow-up questions?
No, I appreciate that. Again, I really appreciated the comment. It's more of an art than a science. Right. And that was really helpful. And, you know, what's also interesting here is, should the legislators and regulators do a cost benefit analysis when they're thinking about what objectives they want to develop? Or would they develop the objectives and then let the utility do the cost benefit analysis? And I can see applying a cost benefit analysis on both sides of that. And that's more of a comment, but I don't know whether that's a issue or recognized already, or I'd be interested to know what your opinion might be about that.
I would agree you could do that either way. In theory, I think it makes sense for the jurisdiction, whether it's legislators, regulators, or other state energy offices, define the objectives first and the policy goals. And then that leads you to your tests and your analysis and then your results. But I will say in practice, once people see results, it might influence what they decide and how much priority they want to give to different outcomes. In fact, we're going to talk a little bit about that later on.
Okay. I really appreciate it. Thanks for pausing for me. Thank you.
No, these questions are great. Please don't hesitate to ask more.
Okay.
Thanks, Julie and Tim.